Well, many share the opinion that Washington's pursuing a larger goal than just regime change across the Arab world. Let's bring into the picture from Brazil the Asia Times correspondent Pepe Escobar. Ask him about the role some countries are playing in the uprisings. Evening to you, Pepe. I mean, one of your recent articles just been reading, you cite China as one of Gaddafi's major financial partners. Does that mean, therefore, carrying this one through, this train of thought, that Beijing has a vested interest in keeping the status quo?
Well, it goes way beyond Libya, in fact. I'm working on a story at the moment pitting the Pentagon against China. This is the big story in Africa for the next 50 years, I would say. Starts in the beginning of the 2000s with the creation of the African Union. Gaddafi was very important in this mechanism. It was a mechanism to give a political voice to Africa, and in terms of better unified Africa, in terms of political decisions and of course economic integration. Then China started investing much more than it was investing during the 1990s all over Africa, in at least 30 countries. They have more than 900 projects all over Africa. They are the #1 oil importer from Angola, for instance. They import materials, platinum materials and metals from at least a dozen different African countries. And then came the reaction from the Pentagon, 2007, 2008, with the African Command, which has just launched its first African war when they launched the Tomahawks 3 weeks ago against Tripoli, basically. So now this is the chessboard. It's the Pentagon via African against Chinese investments. And in the middle are, I would say, at least 50 African governments, and they are scrambling to see, okay, what are we going to do now?
Pepe, let me just focus in a bit here. Okay, so you're saying there's an opinion that Iran... There is an opinion, actually, isn't it, that Iran is Washington's end game here, after Libya, maybe Syria too. Now, taking into consideration those Chinese investments you've been talking about, let's focus in on Iran. Can we expect to see China take sides, maybe, if the threat of regime change reaches Mahmoud Ahmadinejad? Yes or no? What do you think?
I would say no, because the next domino to fall, if we follow the agenda established by Washington, would be Syria. I would say that let's look at the window of opportunity for the next 5 or 6 weeks in Syria. If the lifting of the state of emergency by President Bashar al-Assad holds, and but the protests continue, then we're going to have major trouble, because not only the U.S. is trying to destabilize the Bashar al-Assad government, like the recent reports and the WikiLeaks cables prove it, but also Saudi Arabia is financing the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria. And the Muslim Brotherhood, it basically is a weaponized ideological arm of Saudi Arabia. They would love to have a very, very close ally in Syria in the form of a Muslim Brotherhood government. So I would say pay attention to Syria in the next 5-6 weeks.
And how far would Washington ever push this? China is, of course, a major creditor for the US. How far would Washington go in competition with Beijing?
Well, the problem is there are different Washington agendas. White House, national security agencies, CIA, the Pentagon. The Pentagon basically is the African agenda. They want to win the war in Libya, install an African base in Africa. We have to remember the African headquarters in Stuttgart in Germany, because nobody in Africa wanted the headquarters based in an African country. And then there are the dominoes, Libya, Ivory Coast, Eritrea, Zimbabwe, Somalia. So these are the next dominoes to fall according to the African Pentagon agenda. And then later on, the big dominoes would be the countries where China has substantial investments. Example, Angola, Nigeria, Algeria, and Equatorial Guinea. So we have to watch how this is going to play out in the medium term. But the Chinese, you better be certain about it. Their counter strategy, if they see that they are floundering in Africa because of the militarization of the continent, they will renew their ties with South America and with Central Asia. So they have many I would say, escape routes.
Let's focus back in, Pepe, on Libya and Syria. Tunisia and Egypt, they got what they wanted, the people. They toppled their leaders. Do you think the Libyans and the Syrians will be as successful in their thirst for change? What do you think the picture is going to play out here like?
Well, you mentioned it's not certain. We still don't know what's going to happen in Egypt. We are still getting reports that the transitional military council in Egypt is not doing basically anything. They're holding the reins of the government. The only major concession would be to try Mubarak and Sons for corruption, established corruption. But we don't know what's going to happen in the elections, if they take place this year or beginning of next year. Depending on what happens in Egypt, I think the great 2011 Arab revolt will have a second wind, and it will go all over the place. And this will include certainly Syria. It would re-include Bahrain, apart from the counter-revolutionary offensive by the Saudis. And hopefully, this is what any progressive in the world hopes, one day it will reach Riyadh, because this is the essence of the whole thing. As long as we still have the House of Saud controlling the Persian Gulf, which they call the Arabian Gulf, you know, this is a reactionary 7th century regime allied with Washington and Western powers, and nothing substantially will change in the Arab world.
You know, we're bouncing around here mentioning a lot of countries. You're mentioning all those countries you are. I'm talking about Iran, China. Let's focus back in on China. There's so much in the melting pot here, and China's international policy. You know, to date it's been rather neutral. Do you expect it to become more vocal on the international arena as these things develop that you're talking about?
No, Kevin, no, because Chinese diplomacy, it's a game of Chinese boxes. It's very sophisticated. It's fascinating to study when you're there and from the outside, because, you know, it's layers and layers and layers. They work in secrecy, in a very subtle manner. They don't antagonize, especially the hyperpower, the U.S. They are, at the moment, I would say they are playing a wait-and-see game to see what's going to happen, especially in Libya. They know what's going to happen in the Persian Gulf. Saudi Arabia took over. They can live with that because it's their #1 oil exporter, is Saudi Arabia. You know, it's always between Saudi Arabia and Angola. And in Libya, they're going to see if NATO, AFRICOM, the Pentagon wins, or if the country is balkanized. As long as they keep their oil contracts intact, it's good for them. If they are canceled to the profit of Western oil corporations, they'll strike deals somewhere else. Another deal with Turkmenistan, another deal with Russia, for instance, another deal with Venezuela, another deal in Brazil, which is going to be exporting oil in 5-6 years.
As you say, Pepe, you know,
a range of options.
There's so much in the melting pot, isn't there? We're out of time for now. Always a pleasure to have you in the programme. Pepe Escobar, Asia Times correspondent, joining us live from Brazil. Thank you too.